Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Musarat and Suparna. Thanks a lot for being with us, fourth occasion. I think perhaps I knew Avnish directly. He worked with me, so losing him at that point of time was quite a shock in the entire career for me. Was a very tough phase for Maruti, very tough phase for me as a professional HRIR, a very tough phase for me as a person also. He was a very gentle guy, very competent, very committed, uh, very good human being. So it was more a shock why it happened to Avnish. And therefore, perhaps I thought the best tribute from our side will be that we continue building that sacrifice towards building this professional education on especially employee relations. 25 years back, I was sharing with Mr. Santhanam, perhaps we all drifted into white-collar HR and completely forgot ER skills. But when we started our careers, and I started 37 years back, ER was quite a prominent input to our professional education. We are trying to fill this gap for this memorial in the memory of Avnish. And when we were designing this session, and I knew that Mr. Santhanam will start and then Mr. Parthasarthi, I know both of them very well. And I was looking at the problem I was creating for myself coming third. It's like a student who prepares so hard one week and then the morning when you enter the classroom, you tend to forget everything. I'm feeling something with the two speakers already there. But one very interesting thing is happening is, I didn't speak to Mr. Santhanam what he's going to speak, or Mr. Parthasarthi. And while coming yesterday in this Air India flight, I was reading this latest Business India magazine, and they were talking of exactly what Mr. Santhanam said, this digital disruption, with robos coming in big way. Maruti is using big way now in the last 5 years. And what kind of disruption the digital potentially will create into various parts of our professional life, personal life. And normally we are by default reacting to these situations rather than professionally, proactively doing this scenario building exercise. Very rarely that is happening. And I am talking to you one very practical thing. We are seeing this VUCA world, very dynamic, very volatile, uncertain, ambiguous, and we know it will stay that way. But when I started my career in 1979, there was no VUCA or nothing. It was a very well-defined concept of producing certain tractors at escorts and then counting the money in the evening. That was the business model at that point of time. But now it is not there, doesn't exist. And many of those companies also doesn't exist which wanted to operate only in that environment. So in this VUCA world, I also see a very strong pace of globalization now touching India. Every 5 years, this pace is changing. Everything is getting globalized. And then, obviously, if it is digital today, then geo-datagiri we recently witnessed from Reliance, and all kinds of challenges are going to be there. And I am talking of one very simple example. There was this little HR policy, famous HR policy, or traveling rules will be so and so, hotel, boarding, lodging, telephone expenses. And those telephone expenses were set somewhere back in Maruti, 2,000 rupees per month. But with all this Reliance and everything coming, it's all a joke, 2,000 rupees per month as the telephone expenses. So perhaps somewhere we need to introspect. Also, perhaps I look at one very typical perspective is businesses which we were familiar with are getting challenged. When Flipkart, when we look at Ola coming in, when we look at Paytime coming in, they are actually redefining the very method of doing businesses, startups when we are looking at. And I have one question for all of you. In all these, many of these startups, there are huge number of people involved. Say, for example, Amazon and Flipkart. You must see those people who are driving those motorcycles and delivering this a big kind of bag at their back, and they are delivering door-to-door material. Where is the IR issue there? Why there is no strike there? Why? So perhaps when we look at this huge shift, we are looking at it is more critical for every employee to understand, whichever company, whichever sector, is that if the company or the business does well, then he or she survives and their family and prosperity also goes. This is a cardinal principle for last 30, 40 years badly ignored by many corporates. And Mr. Bhargav, who's the chairman for Maruti Suzuki and literally a kind of founding father for the company, very strongly believes that management as well as workers, employees are both in it. Either you win or you fail. Mutually interdependent. This is one perspective I thought very important for us to look at. Another actual live experience I talked to you, because Maruti we work with roughly 4 generations right now, or more clearly 3. So the older workers, when I spend time with them today, and they have got this housing courtesy, Mr. Bhargav's conceptual thinking, 1994, 95, 96. So they tell me, Mr. Bhargav is our God. Company has given us everything. Mr. Bhargav has given us the most safe this thing for my family, a roof over our head. He has given us housing, which was, they have worked for 20, 25 years, then they got this housing scheme, and they say Mr. Bhargav is our God. This is the old worker. The middle age, around 40s, 35, 40s, they are very much worried about their family, so they must have a good salary, settled life, maybe promotion to a supervisor level. That's their aspiration. And then maybe housing also now, because they have put in 20 years. That's the middle group. And the younger group I met, the millennials, they are just 1 year into the company. They want a very big salary, including variable bonus, participating in the gain sharing. And they want also housing right now, in the second year of their service itself. And I was discussing what kind of housing you would like. So I thought, and most of us thought, Mr. Odawa, myself, my colleague, Mr. Raju, Mr. Bhargav, everybody, we all thought that they will be looking at this workers' housing, 1-bedroom apartments. So when I interacted with these guys, most of them were of the view that please look at 2-bedroom. And some of them said that we can contribute even personally a bit more, but 3-bedroom I'll prefer. Can you see the shift? And we were thinking that at some stage, maybe when they are 5, 7, 10 years old, they can have kind of motorcycles and then migrate to maybe true value cars, second-hand cars. But they are actually looking at Swift to start with, forget about Alto. They are not believing. That's another major shift, which Mr. Santhanam also talked about, this shift in demography, whether we are acknowledging and preparing for it. Anyway, some little perspective, perhaps I'll talk to you here, but I agree with Mr. Santhanam and also Mr. Parthasarathy. India at the moment is in a tremendous potential opportunity for economic growth. And it will be also doing a great this thing for the people involved, because we are going to be relatively a very young country over the next 50 years. And that is the opportunity, as he said, China had it earlier, we are going to have it now. How to handle this well from the employee relations perspective. Just for your information, for 2020, Maruti would like to do 2 million cars. And our managing director, Mr. K. Ayukawa, and Mr. Bhargav talked to me in 2014 that perhaps one challenge which we see towards 2020, Maruti reaching 2 million car sales, is that the suppliers, auto component suppliers, are not competent to handle management and people management issues. So we started some initiative to help them broad base their capabilities so that they can also grow with us to 2 million. That's the kind of critical impact, core business impact I think HRIR will have on business success or failure. A small background, I thought there's something similar which Mr. Parthasarathy was sharing. Perhaps the toughest phase was 70s and 80s for IR in the country. But I am seeing a research kind of very worrying perspective that now violence has started coming in from 2005 onwards, back again. Numbers are low, but this research is to be seen, captured properly. And to a great extent, this period is 2005 to 2015, where the problem has started coming up again. When we look at All India Organization of Employers, as per their report, while strikes and protests in common, the global phenomena, in the recent years in India we are facing an alarming situation, something similar which I said. The increase in number of unrest leading to violence and killings. And down south, I think Praikal was a very big shock for all over the country. Maybe Greater Noida, there was a big problem and one of the CEOs was killed, lynched to death. And then we had this Maruti issue, 2012. And there is one common thread which perhaps is emerging is some very good companies, very professional companies with tremendous intent for welfare and goodwill, uh, taking good care of workers. They have also faced this issue. They are not companies which are exploitative in nature, which are mismanaged, which are incompetent, is another perspective. Perhaps we also see around 5 factors most of these strikes are taking a research. Wages, indiscipline, misconducts, service conditions, recognition of trade unions, because companies have started believing that you have a union, you get into a big problem. And then perhaps contractors and contractualization of work has become one of the prime reasons for these industrial strikes. We also perhaps look at that how this distribution is, wages is the topmost reason, 65% kind of provocation is for this perspective of salary, wages, bonus. Service conditions 30%, maybe new union 28%, and contractors and contractualization of work about 34%. There is no sum total because some are common causes, more than one creating this kind of. And this scenario 2005 onwards is what we have. Now, coming back to my own thinking, I wanted to give you a little glimpse of a comparative view of, in the past, what I remember seeing around in the corporates. When we look at top management or the kind of top leadership, people orientation and employee relations is a low priority and low attention is paid to it. I am being very frank and very candid, and I am talking of a kind of a bird's eye view of about 200 companies in the manufacturing space, automobiles as well as auto components. Also seeing companies in the neighborhood which are not related to this space but broadly into engineering, tractors. Generally, the entire industry is reacting to something which happens. Proactive, very low percentage of companies. Perhaps I was just talking, maybe came to know this morning that Bhiwadi St. Gobain has got a benchmark facility. Perhaps I would like to personally visit and see that. Rane Group is another great exception. There are some companies which have established a very good benchmark, positive benchmark, but this is a general observation. More the management approach is immediate term rather than looking at medium term or long term. And to a great extent, this also reflects in many companies now moving up to 75%, 85% contract workers are working, 15% regular workers are working, which shows the threat, the lack of confidence in the earlier model, where perhaps there was no contract workers. When I started working with escorts in 1975, there was no contract worker system at all at that point. 100% regular workers. And we used to, as Mr. Santanam said, we used to have some temporary workers on the rolls of the company for this upsurge and downsurge kind of regularization. Labor cost from the corporate side is still seen as a burden, a negative cost. And investment in training is just waste of time, waste of money, waste of resources. Perhaps on the trade unions and worker side, when we look at very high expectations on salary, unrealistic at times, and on bonus. Even if company is not making profits, they want their bonus piece of share. They think that the moment they form a union, everything will become positive. Fortunately, unfortunately, somewhere this has been confirmed also. Also, perhaps with them, negative leadership, which talks about strikes and protests and a very tough approach, that is more preferred rather than an educative kind of a normal approach. Positive thinking from a trade union leader is not preferred. Perhaps we also look at that the moment something happens, they would like to react either through tool down or a protest. And their understanding of business, competition, global business environment, what is going to happen, digital robos, is literally not there. This is where perhaps in the past we have seen things happening. Now when we look at, in a very quick view, globalization, changing demography, maybe when we look at companies to somehow get the production and productivity, somehow supply to Maruti, they keep on compromising. That kind of visibility is very much there, that they do not want to give certain benefits or this thing, but they keep on giving because there is no other option according to them. So compromise approach. Being firm is only talked in conferences, but very difficult to practice in industry, especially for HR and ER professionals. Being firm is a provision which is perhaps ruled out by most companies. And to a great extent, principle of inclusiveness is where a lot of agitations will come into the future. And you look at this Haryana Jat agitation, or you look at something which is happening in Gujarat, I think expressions will be something else, but behind the cause, somewhere principle of inclusiveness will get challenged. And obviously labor laws, better we not talk about it. There is one concern in my mind based on what we have seen so far is workers are much better united within the factory and within the industrial area also. And now with this kind of WhatsApp and SMS and everything and smartphones, this has become a much stronger kind of mutual communication and exchange of information between companies in the workmen and the unions, which I see. Trade unions, in spite of their ideological differences, they come together on common platforms. But corporates and industries do not come together very coherently. Somewhere it is forced by CII, SOCM is okay, FICCI, but honestly, there is no intention to do things in a collaborative manner and fight it out. And therefore, firmness they lose, compromise they are falling into a kind of a trap, because the workers and the unions I have seen, they are more organized. This is one little concern, perhaps. Maybe each company also feels that they are doing a great job and nothing will happen to them. All others are not really capable, and it's a very strange kind of individualistic, isolated perspective. One perspective which normally we have picked up from people like Mr. Bhargav, who spent almost close to maybe 45 years in the industry, is that perhaps how do the workers must be having their aspirations, whether there is any focus on that in terms of the growth and benefits, kind of growth of the company, whether it can be combined, whether the company cares for me, dignity of respect Mr. Parthasarathy was talking of, whether I can have a career plan in this company or I will remain a worker after 25 years. And one question therefore is that they very easily start respecting a trade union leader or external leader even outside the company, but why they are not able to have this respect for the company leadership is somewhere little issue is involved. There is one very important study which I did heading with CII, a little effort and involving 10, 12 of our HR counterparts, 12 companies, 8,000 sample population, 50% permanent employees, and we also included Mr. Santhanam, because this number is increasing, contract workers. We also asked them this survey through Deloitte. 47% Gen Y, 38% Gen X, and 15% baby boomers. That was the kind of sample we looked at. More than 1 out of every 2 employees mentioned low salary, low compensation as one of their top concerns wherever they were working. And 1 out of every 4 Gen Y workers who switched, because they can switch jobs, rated career aspirations as the main provocation. And all the groups considered standard of living such as children education, and Mr. Parthasarathy was talking about it, is becoming healthcare, becoming very important consideration for a worker's family. Food has been rated as the highest expenditure item overall by generations. So if we briefly see salary, career aspirations, and standard of living, they come in my mind as the key aspirations of blue-collar people. Ill treatment by seniors, though overall rated low in challenges faced, has been rated high by contract and project contract workers. I have seen it with my own eyes, so I fully endorse this outcome which is coming. For baby boomers, Gen X, lack of housing and lack of progression possibilities have come out as the highest ranking challenges. The younger generation of both Gen X and Gen Y prefer internal unions as compared to the external unions. And I was talking to Mr. Santan that there is a disconnect between the union leaders and the Gen Y, because Gen Y say, deliver me this benefit and then get out. There is no respect for any long-term union leader or any such thing. Is the development which we are seeing right now. Union leaders are telling me, even within Maruti, that if issues are not resolved fast, they are afraid of going to the shop floors, face the workers. Our union leaders. But the problem is union leaders are mostly also Gen Y and little bit of Gen X. But workers Gen Y, predominant, are very, very, what I will say, restless kind of people for meeting their ambitions, whether it is union or whether it is company. Their line of fire and their expectation will be something similar. Perhaps in my thinking, when we look at a strategic framework for 2020 and even beyond, I agree with Mr. Santhanam, we can look at maybe 2030. Somewhere ethical based leadership in the company at the top will be perhaps my first essential prerequisite. Without that, it will be very tough to have expectations of a collaborative, profitable, sustained business growth and this thing working in any company, and there can be problems. And when we look at perhaps the first responsibility of that top leadership is that they will have to look at what work environment they are going to provide to their young people or people with age and experience, white collar, blue collar. Somewhere this will become a very critical perspective. In Manesar, which was started as a separate company by Maruti in 2005, 2006, perhaps in my thinking, if I was looking at that responsibility at that point of time, my learning is that when you recruit people in the company, blue collar, including contract workers, you should pay more attention to them than even while you recruit presidents and vice presidents. No problem handling them. But there, I think somewhere that investment is extremely critical. And then perhaps focus on communication, education, training, competitive salary and benefits. And when I talk of this recruitment perspective for same way for HR and ER professionals, I also have a grave concern there. I was sharing before the session that when I look at North, where we are located, and when I look at roughly about 200 supplier companies, auto component space, and when I remember meeting those HR, IR managers, it is pathetic profiles who are playing that role there. And the businesses are still somehow managing with this handicap, and life is going on. But there are tremendous potential for disputes and problems and conflicts and strikes and all that. And therefore this initiative we started 2014. But to my horror, when I thought of training those 200 or 250 odd people, including production heads and the HR heads, I think it was big problem in my mind. And perhaps when I look at some such effort in the memory of Awanish, I am deeply passionate about it, that perhaps we should create this capability, that situation, that deficit which is visible should not be there. And you people will be surprised that in Australia, a very sporting nation, they have tremendous achievement and pride and effort. And when they are working with the Australian Army to create some core teams in rugby, cricket and all that, the part of the core team selection process, they look for one particular perspective. Can you guess anyone of not communication capability, not personality, not degree, not smartness, not some talent? They look for one perspective in the core team of 2030 which they want to make for rugby, say for example. Anybody? Team player, attitude, to a great extent attitude. And they define attitude is by somebody who must have failed miserably in doing something what he is doing, cricket or rugby or army. And if he has failed, and if he has bounced back, kicked back, then he has the experience of handling failure, experience of handling adversity. If a person who is always talent driven and he's always won with his talent, he never experienced failure. The moment he faces talent going down and some failure coming, he will absolutely be at loss of words or ideas or capability to come up again. And therefore, they prefer people who have failed. In our case, in HR and IR and leadership teams, Mr. Parthasarthi was also talking of senior management personnel. Somewhere we need to bring in these kinds of tough rotations and experiences to prepare people to be capable of handling adversity, capable of handling, complexity, maybe ambiguity. Somewhere IR, industrial relations or employee relations, will remain with this young population very unpredictable moving forward over the next 10, 15 years. So this is perhaps a little perspective which I thought will be helpful for when we look at Mr. Bhargav's contribution in Maruti, when we look at our learning from Suzuki Japan, and recently Mr. Ayukawa has been emphasizing, who's our managing director, that can we give a kind of development hand-holding to our workers so that they become capable leaders and supervisors as they grow in life. They have been emphasizing this again and again. But what I have seen in the fraternity and the actual reality in corporates, a worker, let us keep him as long as possible as worker. ऐसी पॉलिसी बनाओ कि ये इसी में घूमता रहे. Totally reverse thinking. Why we are doing it, I am not able to understand. Somewhere there is a gap there. Maybe in leadership on shop floor, we are more attuned of listening for abuses and abusive behavior. I am sure Ramesh has handled Hyundai, must have gone through all these experiences. But I think what I personally have introduced with my colleagues in Maruti in the last 10, 11 years is more a listening leadership. A leadership which has the patience to listen. That's all. Appreciate. And both are free. Listening is free and appreciation is also free. You don't have to ask for any budget or approval from the board or anywhere. But it is sadly missing from our that equation where we say that we are one team. And perhaps welfare, when we look at medical, housing, children education, is a very huge perspective for them still. And when we look at contractualization of work, perhaps we need to look at some discipline of professional management. We need to look at some ratios. But to a great extent, I think it will all happen. There's a strategic roadmap addressing these challenges. When board level review of HR and ER starts taking place, just like it is reviewed for sales and marketing, for production, for supply chain, that is the shift which FICCI, CII, Rajiv Dubey, myself, we have been working, and we are involving companies who are going to look at this model where HR, IR will become a board level function to be reviewed. And obviously that shift will bring in a professional kind of perspective. Why we are moving towards this objective is more towards a violence-free workplace, is what we started with Rajiv Dubey, all of us at that point of time, starting from FICCI, then CII, with harmony, ownership and commitment, maybe looking at real teamwork, progress and well-being of people. And that's where perhaps Maruti, we are making our best efforts, that we should be developing 2020 as one single team, whether workers or whether supervisors, managers, or top leadership, maybe learning from Suzuki Japan to a great extent. Concept of one team. Coming together is the small beginning. Keeping together is where perhaps we can look at this potential progress, and perhaps working together is ultimately where the company results and people well-being is being attempted. So I sincerely thank you for joining us for this initiative. It's a little different, unique initiative. It is in the name of one of our own fraternity person, well-respected, and somewhere the need for this capability building is, in my thinking, is very critical. I thank you for your kind attention. Thanks a lot.